If you've been following my design system videos, you already know I've taught you how to set up colors, typography, and much more. But one thing I keep getting asked is how I handle gradients. Luckily for you, I had a client with a very complex gradient setup. Multi-brand, themable, and way too easy to mess up. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the exact workflow that I used to bring order to the chaos, to make gradients scalable, consistent, and usable across your enterprise design system. Let's dive in. Whoa. That gradient's nice. We also just launched UI Collective Academy, where I show you how I built the collective kit, succeed in freelance design, and much more on the way. Check out all that's included on our website. I'll put a link down below. Now, what we're showing here is a brand new approach to setting up your gradients, okay? Now, I've shown you different ways to do it in the past, but you can yell at me in the comments, but design systems are always evolving. The way in which we build design systems is always changing with the times as we discover new approaches, work on new client projects. And this is an approach that I've taken with a recent client project in terms of setting up gradients and opacity, simply just because they had, let's just say, an absolute ton of gradients. They had gradients that had 8 or 9, 10 stops in some cases and were super complex. And it almost went above and beyond what we might want to store in a brand collection. So what we have here is we've introduced a new collection. So in past videos I've already introduced you to brand collections. I've already introduced you to alias collections, maps collections, and responsive collections. What we're doing, if you are in a use case where you have a lot of different gradients with your brand, we're introducing a gradients in opacity collection. This is where we're handling all the colors and all the stops associated with your gradients and the associate colors with the correct opacity applied. Let's take a look at that next. So with every gradient that you have, you got to be familiar with the term that's called a gradient stop. So essentially what that is here, if I go ahead and add in just a gradient here, you're going to notice when you add in a gradient, there's all these different stops. You might have 1 stop, you might have 2 stop, you might have 3 stop, you might have 4 stops, as you see right here. What we're actually going to be doing is defining what these stops are inside of this collection. Now, there's always different types of gradients. Personally, and in the way I've set up our collective kit, again, link for that below, is I like to have my gradients nice and clean. I don't like to have a ton of different stops. I only like to have two gradients. So what I always have here is a default gradient. So I'm going to create a default grouping. And inside this default grouping, I'm going to specify what that stop is, okay? So this here is going to be stop 1. And this is going to go ahead and connect to our primary 800. Still within our alias collection, not looping back to the brand collection. Then what I'm going to do is define the stop 2. In this case, our primary 1100. Now, if you have multiple stops, this is where you could add additional stops. So stop 1, stop 2, stop 3, and stop 4. So if I had 4 stops, this might be a 500, this might be a 600, this might be an 800, and then this here might be an 1100. Okay, you can kind of play around with however many stops that you want inside of this default gradient. Now, as I mentioned before, I like my gradients nice and clean, and the way that I've set up the collective kit, I only have 2 stops in my gradient. So here we have our stop 1, which is going, it was not 41, our stop 2. So we have our stop 1, which is our primary 800, and our stop 2, which is our primary 1100. And now, just as an example as to how you might have what's called an inverse gradient, is all you can do is you can actually duplicate this group, just call it your inverse, and then make some adjustments. So instead of having these dark colors here, what you would do is you would assign, let's say, where's our foundations? Let's go with our foundations white. Again, you can learn how to build this variable library with a video that I've done in the past. I'll put a link for that down below. And then this here might become our primary 300. So you're going to notice some consistency with how I've set up my gradients here, where I always have the first stop as the lighter shade, so the white, and then the second stop as the darker shade. So what you can do, just give your gradients a name. There really is no best approach to naming your gradients. And then set up all the different stops within each of those gradients. So again, our default stop 1 and stop 2, and then our inverse stop 1 and stop 2. So now that we have this set up, let's go ahead and start looking at how I build out my gradients, how I name my gradients that are actually consumed by my clients, designers who I work with, both if there is no opacity and if there is opacity. Now, here we are just within the collective kit where we store our tokens. And again, I show you how to build this library for free. I'll put a link for that YouTube video down below. So here we are just within the gradient section. So let's go ahead and actually build this out together. Now, you're going to see this area where we have our first gradient. Notice how I'm calling this top. And the reason why I call it top is, see, one mistake I see a lot of designers make is they have it just the naming just as gradient 1, gradient 2, gradient 3, gradient 4. But gradients, depending on where their stops go, they can go in all these different directions. So what I actually like to do is define where that default stop is. And then based off where that default stop 1 is I call that the name of the gradient. If that's confusing, bear with me. Let's look at it. So if I was to go in here and let's set this as a gradient. So see this first stop here? If I was to apply our default stop 1 to the top and then our default stop 2 as the bottom, that's why I call it the top, is because our lighter color, our stop 1, is at the top. So what I can then do is I can go ahead, add a new style that we're going to call solid default gradients, okay? And then our top. So now, if I click, where we go here, we have our solid default gradient with the position at the top. Let's look at another quick example before we build out the rest of them. So if I was to really just inverse them now, so if we want to call this our bottom, what I can do, I can go in here, swap them. That easy, right? So now our lighter stop, so our default stop 1 is at the bottom, coming from the bottom, so our gradient is then going to become bottom. So let's go ahead and create a style for this. So we have our solid default gradients, bottom. So really that simple. So now in our styles, we have the position based off where that default stop 1 is. Now this technique isn't just specific to top and bottom. A lot of gradients, the stop 1 can often be inside a corner and almost expand out and go inside all these different directions. So in this case, how I would handle it, if we have this set as like top right, you can specify where that stop 1 is. So if we go ahead and make some adjustments here, let's flip this back the opposite direction. We could set this to top right, and then we can play around with where we want to position that default stop to. So now we can go ahead, apply a new style, call this our solid default gradients, and then top right. There we go. So now let's go ahead and make sure that it's there. I named it right, which I did. And now we can do the same with, let's say, a top left. So the exact same thing, but just position the gradient a little bit differently. So let's go ahead inside, make some adjustments here, play around with it, try to get it as close to as possible. Well, I'm not too sure what happened there. And then this here would be called our top left. Now, gradients are a little bit finicky in the sense where you kind of have to eyeball it a little bit to try to get a little bit consistent, but I think that doesn't look half bad. So there's our top left. Let's create the style for this. So this is our solid default gradient, top left. There we go. So now we also have the position. But again, there's also different types of gradients that you might want to add. Things like radial, diamond. Let's take a look at that next. Now, Figma, of course, also has some of these base gradient types, things like radial, things like diamond gradients that we also might like to introduce, okay? I like these specifically for things like our headers. So what we can do is then we can also introduce different treatments for these. So in this case, we can set this one to our radial, and we can play around with this as best as we want. And again, really same thing. We can go ahead, click in, create the style of this that we're going to call our solid default gradient. And we have our radial. There we go. Now that's an option for selection. Let's go ahead and maybe look at one more. I really don't like the angular. So we're going to go ahead and skip the angular. Maybe just look at our diamond. So something really similar that we can do, almost like tweak it in the middle a little bit. There we go. Make the adjustments as necessary. And then we can go ahead, create a new style for this that we're going to call our solid gradient. Solid default gradient, default gradient. And then this here is going to become our diamond. Let's go ahead, change the wording of this. And again, while we're already here, maybe we actually just do a radial just in case. I'm not the biggest fan. Diamond. How do you spell diamond? There we go. I think that's right. Anyways, we're going to skip over that for now. And then let's go ahead and look at an Angular, excuse me. So what we have for the Angular, I'm not a big fan of the Angular, but we can go ahead and just add that as such. And let's go ahead, of course, create the style of this that we're going to call our solid default gradient. And then our Angular. So now that we have sort of these base variables out of the way that all our designers can actually pull from, is what happens and how do we set that up? We have some opacity involved in some of these stuffs. What do we do with the variable collection, and then how do we apply that here? So you know, as well as I know, that gradients are not always this simple. They don't always just have solid stops. Oftentimes gradients are placed over top of like a hero image or an image in like a blog card where there's some level of opacity for some of those stops inside of that gradient style. Now, how do we set this up? So what I actually like to do first, I go back to all variables. I put all of our default and inverse or whatever other types of full styles that we use inside this grouping that I call full gradients. Or full gradients defaults. Let's copy this here, our full gradient defaults. And then this is going to be, our full gradient inverse. Then what I do is I go create another grouping here that we just call our opacity, if I can spell, primary. And then let's start off with 10%. Okay. Now, in the context of the client that I was actually just working with, they had about 5 or 6 different colors inside of their gradients. This is where you would actually define a lot of those colors if they have an opacity. So in the case of our primary color that we were using up here, so our primary 800, so if we just copy this hex code and let me undo that here, what I would do is I would paste this in, and now I apply the opacity to it. Okay, so just set this to 10%. Then this would become 20%, and I would adjust this to 20%. And again, the reason why these variables are detached is we can't have an opacity variable applied. It needs to be detached, and then you apply the level of opacity. So this here is going to be 20%. This here is going to be 30%. Adjust this accordingly. This here is going to be 40%. Set this to 40%. This is going to be 50%. This is going to be 50%. This is going to be our 60%. This is going to be our 60. This is going to be our 70. Set this to our 70. This is going to be our 80. This is going to be our 80. Oops, did something wrong there. This is going to be our 80. This is going to be our 90. Set this to our 90. And we don't need to go with that 100% because we already have that applied in the defaults. Now, if I had additional colors that I would use, okay, so I can just duplicate this group. And I can just set this to red and then change all of these to our red color if we needed to. So sorry, let me delete that there. Let's try to find a red color. There we go. Let's go ahead, set this to a 10%. So we just change the hex code out and we can set this to our red or also to our error as well. And again, we can use that approach if we do have like 5 or 6 different colors inside of those gradients. So hopefully now you can see how we set up both our full gradients and also how we set up our opacities that then go into our gradient styles. Let's take a closer look at that next before we look at light and dark mode gradients. So then what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, and these are actually going to become our overlay gradients. Because any gradient that has an opacity, it's always over top of something. It's never just in on its own, at least usually, okay? So what we think we can then do is we just go into each of these and just change this out for whatever opacity that we want, okay? Again, from the top. So the top in this case would be wherever that gradient variable is applied. Same thing here. Then this would be our 10%. And then this is where you can also get into additional stops. Okay, so say we want to add one in between. What we can then do is we can then apply if we go to our library here, search for opacity, we can then apply all this specific gradient accordingly in order to adjust our opacity. So same thing with our top right. We can just set this to our opacity 10%. Make some adjustments here if we need to. And then same with our top left, so on and so forth. Set this to our opacity 10%. So when you do need to add opacities, a level of opacity to your gradients, that's generally how you would set it up, okay? So in terms of the actual naming, here we have our solid default gradients. Here we would have our overlay default gradients. So what this would then be is this would become our overlay default gradients coming from the top, so on and so forth. And now we have all those styles that are readily available for our designers to apply. Now that we have that out of the way, let's briefly look at inverse and then also our light dark. So now in terms of our inverse, now that we have these all set up here, so we have our inverse, which is stop 1 and stop 2. So what we would then do is we, inside of our opacities, we actually don't really need a separate almost grouping for our default and our inverse within the opacity. We can just add all the different colors that we would have here. So if I was to just duplicate this group, just call this our white, because again, our inverse, our stop 1 is that white. I can then just go ahead, set this to white for each of them. There we go. And then really that simple. So with that out of the way, now that we have that for our stop 1, what we can do is we can actually just duplicate both of these and we can make some adjustments here. So let's go ahead with this top. Again, maybe I'm not going to make you sit through me doing each of these. So let's go ahead, get rid of those. And now what we can do is just simply swap out the variables, right? So where this would be our default stop 1, in this case, what this would be is our default stop 1 for our inverse, and then our stop 2 for our inverse. And then what we can call this here is, instead of our solid default gradient, this is our inverse default gradients. So this here would become our inverse default gradient top. And then we can go ahead and then apply the same thing down here, okay? So this would be our primary 10%. Now we're applying that white 10%. And then here we would apply whatever the other value is for inverse, which is the stop 2. And then how we have it with our overlay default gradients, this then would become our inverse or overlay inverse default gradients. So this would become our overlay inverse default gradient, and then our top. I know it's a little bit wordy, but oftentimes I find whenever clients have sort of one type of gradient, they tend to have a ton of different ones. So that's why the naming is as it is, okay? So there you go. There's how you can set up your initial gradients. So your base overlay gradients, so your base gradients, your overlay gradients for both your default and also your inverse. And now let's just briefly look at dark mode. Now let's briefly look at light mode and dark mode, because very similar to how we like to have things in our mapped collection, we like to have light and dark mode inside of that mapped collection. Again, if you're not too sure what I'm referring to when I say mapped collection, I'll leave some links down below where you can learn a little bit more about our approach to token architecture. Is if we go back, to our responsive collection, to our gradients and opacity, you'll notice that these here are pulling from your alias collection. Now, this is where it can be kind of confusing when you set up your design system, especially if you're working with multiple brands. Now, this approach here generally only works if you have one brand itself. Because if you were to go into your alias collection, apply a brand, let's say brand 1, and then brand 2 here. Again, I'm dropping another video very soon that covers this a little bit more in depth in terms of our approach to multi-brand design systems. So say here, if you have brand 1 and brand 2, sorry, Figma's a little slow here for whatever reason. If it'll load for me. Sorry, Figma's bugging out there. So if inside of your alias collection, you have brand 1 and brand 2, the colors that are going to be pulled inside of that gradient and opacity, so whatever that primary 800 is, in brand 2, you might want it a little bit different. Okay, so if you're applying dark mode here, all of a sudden there's going to be a break where inside of your alias collection, let's say in your brand 2, you want your gradient to be primary 700 and not primary 800, you're going to run into an issue. So now this approach here generally only works if you have one brand, okay? If you have two brands, what you might want to do is duplicate gradients and opacity and rename this to gradients and opacity, brand 1. It can get pretty complex, but if you are choosing to use a multi-brand approach within one design system and you have a lot of gradients and opacity, it's probably a little bit more scalable. Anyways, that tangents aside, I know that can be a little bit confusing, so ask any questions down below if you need help on that approach. So in terms of your light and dark, what I always do is really just inverse it. So what I have for inverse, our primary 800 is then going to become our foundations white, and then our stop 2 is going to become our primary 300. So you're really just inversing it, and same here as well. This here is our primary 800, and then this here is also our primary 1100. Now, this is always how you start off. Oftentimes, if you have a light gradient or a dark gradient in light mode, you kind of don't always want it to like inverse to a super light color. You might want to maintain that sort of appearance of dark. So you always, gradient is a weird one. You kind of always do need to play around with it just a little bit. And then same for here as well. Just simply swap out the variables. So for 800s are whites, you can just set this to FFF and then just go all the way down inside of your opacity. So that's how you would handle your gradients if you do have other brands, and also for light and dark mode as well. Again, I do have another video coming out where we go into multi-brand handling in the context of our design system. I'm aiming to get it out this week. So be sure to check that out where I cover this topic a little bit more in depth. But hopefully now you have a pretty good idea as to how you can set up gradients for your design system in a scalable, approachable way.